the first presentation, I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Annie Palermo from NeuRA. She's a Postdoctoral Fellow, and I would like to welcome Annie to the screen. Hello, Annie, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much. I guess the first place that I'd like to start is I'm always interested in what attracts people to SCI research, including researchers. Could you tell us a bit about your background and what drew you to SCI research?
Sure. So I have an uncle who has a spinal cord injury, and I've always been around him growing up, and really, he is the person that drove me to my first kind of career, which was to be a physical therapist or a physio. I did that training in the United States, and then really it was him and questions that we would pose to each other, and also the fact that in the United States, very often it feels like the insurance companies dictate care. And as a researcher, I was able to kind of provide physio-based interventions to people who I felt really needed them for free and didn't have to kind of answer to insurance companies, as long as those interventions fell within what I was doing for a study. So those are really the two big factors that brought me to research.
Okay, and I guess looking through your body of work, it's quite diversified. Maybe if you could share, obviously having been attracted to spinal research, maybe share some of your body of work. Obviously, you've started off in curative or in restoration research to what you're doing now at NeuRA in study of probably, I think some of our viewers may think it's an odd area of respiration and balance, but it's obviously an important area. Maybe if you could share, I guess, your progression through the areas of spinal research.
Sure. So after I became a physical therapist, I was able to work both clinically and in the research setting because in that curative trial you mentioned, it's called the Schwann cell trial, they needed a physio for their interventions. So I was first really exposed to true clinical trial research as kind of being that person to provide the physio-based interventions, but being around research and kind of being in this collaborative environment, I was able to kind of come up with my own questions, or questions again that my uncle and I had talked about, and I couldn't find answers for them. So that really is what kind of spurred me into kind of more of a physio-based research kind of degree, which was my PhD. So I went from that curative research that I was kind of collaborating with to kind of performing my own research, which was more based in things and interventions that a physio would perform with people with spinal cord injuries. That relates to breathing and balance.
Do you feel that as you've matured as a spinal researcher, then that your perception of what it is, I guess, what areas of spinal research are important have changed, or was that sort of shaped, as you say, a bit by your uncle, but a bit as your experience as a researcher as well?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, my uncle, one of my studies in my PhD looked at blood pressure control. And that came about because every time my uncle ate, not every time, but very often if my uncle had a big meal, he would get dizzy and he would have to either recline in his chair or recline in his bed. And so I always wondered, why that happened. So one of the first studies I looked into outside of, the curative trial was looking at blood pressure in people after they've had a spinal cord injury. So, and I think the more interactions that I had with people that have lived experience, the more I understood it's not that people want just the ability to walk. There's all these other factors that really impact quality of life. And as a physio researcher, I could really look into those things and try to figure out how to make their lives a little bit better.
Specifically then looking at your work in respiration and balance, could you tell us and share a bit about your work in that area? And also share why these areas are important. Like I said, the audience may not necessarily traditionally think that these areas are a high priority, or they're not necessarily, not that they're high priority, not that they're necessarily spoken about. So if you could share some of a bit about your work and why it is so important.
Yes. So I was surprised to find out that respiratory complications or poor respiratory function was one of, if not the leading cause of death in people with spinal cord injury. I grew up having an uncle with a spinal cord injury, and I never once thought that that would be one of the possibilities for him to die from, because we as clinicians and as physicians, we are really good at treating respiratory complications in people in general. So, I wanted to have a better idea about why people with lived experience of spinal cord injury were dying at such a high rate from these seemingly treatable conditions. And found that, in my own research and in other people's research, it's actually it's fairly preventable, these complications. So now I am just trying to, get a better idea about which are the best possible interventions to have people perform, to try to prevent respiratory compromise and improve the strength of their respiratory muscles and things like that, so that, maybe we don't have to have so many people dying from respiratory compromise. And then to get that information out to the public and clinicians and people with lived experience, so that they can take their health into their own hands. And so, that's very breathing heavy, but your diaphragm, which is your biggest breathing muscle, also acts as one of your core muscles. So, in people without spinal cord injury, it's fairly well documented that the diaphragm does play a role in balance. But before myself and my group in my PhD worked on kind of looking for a link between those two factors, in people with spinal cord injury, there really wasn't a lot of research in that. So now we have established that there is a relationship between respiratory function and balance in people with spinal cord injury. So potentially now, we can be treating both respiratory function and potentially balance function with maybe one or two interventions.
I know when you mentioned to me the other day about the statistic about that being one of the leading causes of fatality within spinal cord injury, having a spinal cord injury myself, it really resonated with me. And like I said, it's not necessarily something that's well known among the community. You mentioned some findings there and some correlations between balance and respiration. Throughout your research, have there been any other significant findings that have the potential to make real change in the future?
So to find those relationships, I first had to create a balance measure, because we didn't really have a good assessment of balance for people post spinal cord injury. They have some specific to Parkinson's disease. They have some specific to stroke, but there wasn't an assessment specific to people with spinal cord injury. So I worked with clinicians and people with spinal cord injuries and people who were good at developing outcome measures or assessment tools, and came up with this assessment called the FIST, Function in Sitting Test for people with spinal cord injuries, the FIST SCI, based off of something that was already available for people who've had a stroke. But now we have this assessment that we can actually quantify balance, which we didn't have before. And that assessment is being used all across the United States. It's also being translated into Chinese, Italian, and Portuguese. And so hopefully, with this assessment now we can better identify interventions that target balance specifically, because if we can't measure something, we don't actually know if it's changing. So, this hopefully will help to improve balance-based intervention studies, and even potentially clinicians in the United States at least, can use this tool potentially to show insurance companies that people are still improving, and maybe they are able to gain more access to care.
I think even having those discussions, as you say, developing tools purely based on the fact that there is a correlation between balance and respiration opens the avenue to other research that can help in this area. And as you say, that even though that tool has been developed in the United States, the ability to then share that globally has great potential. I think as well, one of the questions that I have for you is that in your current work at NeuRA, what current projects do you have going on, as well as any potential future ideas for projects, as well as obviously from my point of view, trying to get people involved. What opportunities do you have to get people involved with research?
So there's a lot. The study that I'm the most involved in right now looks at respiratory function after acute injury. So, we're recruiting people 5 to 10 days post spinal cord injury, looking at how abdominal functional electrical stimulation, so that stimulation that actually turns the muscles on, how that impacts their breathing function immediately after their injury. Because, like I said, again, this is a really, it's a major cause of death. So if we can limit the amount of respiratory complications that somebody experiences, especially acutely when there's so many other changes happening in their body, maybe we can just take that off the table as another complication that occurs acutely. We're also looking at that type of stimulation and how it might impact bowel function. So, if we use that stimulation to target those abdominal muscles, will it help to improve time required or lessen time required for bowel management? Another study that I'm slightly involved in at NeuRA is called our IOOF trial, and that's spinal stimulation. So stimulation to the spinal cord, but surface spinal stimulation, so no surgeries or anything, looking at how that might improve locomotor function, walking function. And then some ways that people can get involved directly right now. If you're interested in any of those studies, we do have a volunteer database at NeuRA that we're working on filling up. So you can, I think there's probably some way to maybe share a link potentially.
Yeah, maybe share that link.
Yeah. So there's a link that we can share that will bring you directly to the database. It asks you a couple questions about your level of injury, just to see if you might qualify for some of our current or future studies. And then also, we're really looking for input on our FES survey. So that functional electrical stimulation, we want to know how people are using it in the community. And if you're not using it, we also want to know why you're not using it. Is it because you don't have access, or what that might be? But we want to know your perceptions of use of functional electrical stimulation after you've had a spinal cord injury.
Awesome. We'll definitely share those links out and provide opportunities. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our panel discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you.